28-year-old Niqui McCown was on the verge of achieving her dreams. She had a beautiful daughter whom she loved, a job in a field she'd always wanted, a college enrollment that would further her career, and the man she had loved for so long had finally requested her hand in marriage. Everything seemed to be falling into place. On the afternoon of Sunday, July 22, 2001, Nikki kissed her fiance goodbye as she took his SUV down to the local laundromat to take care of their clothing for the week. Things had been hectic as they were preparing for their wedding, which was to take place in 3 weeks. Nikki dropped her daughter off with relatives, went to the laundromat, and got started on the clothes. Later, she stopped by her relative's home and made some calls and complained that men at the laundromat were harassing her. She left to get her clothing out of the dryer, and Niqui McCown was never seen again. Nikki's family desperately searched for her, while 3 men in her life came under suspicion. For authorities, what they initially believed was a case of a bride getting cold feet quickly would become an obvious crime, but for which they could find no evidence. Over the course of the next 18 years, investigators would discover new evidence, make links between other crimes and a suspect in the case, and just when they believed the answers were finally coming, they would be devastated by a shocking turn of events which would leave the case open and officially unsolved. This is Trace Evidence, Episode 70, The Vanishing of Niqui McCown. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. Today we examine the tragic 2001 vanishing of Niqui McCown from Richmond, Indiana. Before getting into the case, just a few notes about the show. Up front, I want to thank all of you who have been incredibly supportive as I've been struggling with some health issues these past few weeks, but I'm hoping to get back on track. Trace Evidence is a weekly true crime podcast focused on unsolved murders and disappearances, examining a different case each Monday. If you have questions, comments, or case suggestions, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com. Follow me on Twitter at TraceEvPod, on Instagram at TraceEvidencePod, or join the Facebook discussion group simply by searching for Trace Evidence. You can visit the website at trace-evidence.com for full episodes, social media links, merchandise, and much more. Trace Evidence is also on Patreon, so if you would like to support the show, please visit patreon.com/traceevidence, where you can get rewards such as stickers, pins, and commercial-free episodes. There's also a PayPal donation link on the website for those of you who don't wish to go through Patreon. This show is a complete one-man operation, and your support is greatly appreciated. As a final note, stick around at the end of this episode for several updates and information regarding Trace Evidence and the true crime community as a whole. This week, we examine one of the most highly requested cases, the vanishing of Niqui McCown. It's a sad story with a lot of chaos, confusion, and heartbreaking results. This is Episode 70, The Vanishing of Niqui McCown. Marilyn Renee Nicole McCown was born on January 6, 1973 in Richmond, Indiana. Nikki quickly became the name by which friends and family referred to her, and as such, throughout the course of this episode, I will also use the name Nikki. Nikki was born into a large family, with 9 brothers and sisters, though her older sister by a year and a half, Michelle, would be her closest sibling and by most descriptions her best friend as well. Richmond boasts a population of just under 37,000 residents and is the county seat of Wayne County. Located in east-central Indiana, Wayne County sits on the border between Indiana and Ohio. Richmond covers just over 24 square miles and is located approximately 73 miles east of Indianapolis and 45 miles west of Dayton, Ohio. The one word which is most frequently used when friends and family members describe Nikki is driven. Nikki had dreams, ambitions, and goals, and was extremely dedicated to achieving them. She performed well in school, worked hard, and was hopeful about her future prospects. Nikki had a strong sense of duty and justice ingrained in her personality, and as such, from a young age, she was drawn to a profession which would not only allow her to function as part of the justice system, but to also be in a position to help those who needed it most. She was a large proponent of change. She wanted to make a difference and to help people who had made poor choices but wanted to correct the course of their lives. Nikki's interest in justice would later lead her to pursue a career which would have resulted in her joining either the FBI or the U.S. Marshals Service. Outside of her ambitions, Nikki was, for the most part, an incredibly kind, caring, outgoing, and social person. She had a magnetic personality, lovely sense of humor, and a contagious laugh to go along with it. There were few people who would encounter Nikki and not be drawn in by her charisma. Of course, though, there are exceptions to every rule. While Nikki was popular and found it easy to move into various social circles, it was apparent that Nikki's physical attributes would be a threat to some. Suffice it to say, as Nikki grew up, she received a lot of attention from young men. One of the first men to catch her attention was Robert Webster, known to most as Bobby. Michelle became friendly with the guy whose best friend was Bobby, and since Nikki spent a great deal of her time with her older sister, she would often tag along on her outings. It was during one of these outings that Nikki would meet Bobby. At the time, Nikki was around 14 years old and preparing to enter high school, while Bobby himself was actually a senior. An attraction developed rather quickly, and it was obvious that it was mutual. There was, however, a problem. Bobby had a reputation for being a player, so to speak, moving from woman to woman without much pomp and circumstance. Nikki was not a foolish young woman and was well aware of his behavior and thus kept him close, but not too close. Bobby's interest in Nikki became a point of contention for several other women with whom he was hanging around. At its peak, the situation would become incredibly difficult for Nikki. She was subjected to insults and threats, and even later, when she began working, she would frequently need to request that a security guard escort her to her ride so she wasn't physically assaulted. Bobby, as it turned out, had a child with one of his former girlfriends, and she, in particular, had a major vendetta against Nikki, going so far as to stalk and threaten the younger woman. Eventually, the situation with Bobby became a major issue, but was resolved rather quickly when Bobby made the choice to move away. In 1991, when Nikki was turning 18, Bobby announced that he'd be leaving Richmond and heading west to California, where he hoped to start a new life and turn over a new leaf. According to all reports, the separation between he and Nikki was quite amicable. Their relationship had been on and off again for more than 3 years at this point. There were no hard feelings, and for Nikki, while her interest in Bobby remained, she had other dreams to pursue, and as he left town, she continued on with the pursuit of those goals. After Bobby's exit, Nikki would eventually meet and begin a relationship with Steve Johnston. According to friends and family, Steve was a nice guy overall, and Nikki was very much in love with him. Steve would go on to father Nikki's daughter, Peyton, when she was 19, and the couple lived together and made plans to raise their daughter. However, things took a bad turn for the relationship when Steve lost his job. For Nikki, she found it incredibly hard to try and put food on the table when she was the only person bringing in any cash. For an ambitious and driven person, it's usually difficult to maintain a relationship with someone who can't carry their half of the responsibilities. On the one hand, Steve was always there to take care of Peyton, but as time continued to pass and he remained unemployed, Nikki grew frustrated, and his apparent lack of drive to find work set her off the deep end. According to Michelle, Steve was a nice person, loved Nikki very much, and treated her well, but things came to a head when Nikki found herself having to turn to friends and family for loans to keep the bills paid. She simply couldn't allow herself or her daughter to continue living in an environment where there wasn't a balance to the work and support. Now, while many have been very kind in their descriptions of Steve, he himself has admitted to several mistakes that he'd made during their relationship. In fact, in an interview with Crime Watch Daily, Steve stated, quote, "If I was smarter, she'd still be here and we would still be together. I wasn't good to her. I wasn't at all. I cheated. I was abusive." End quote. Despite the bad ending of their relationship, Nikki was able to maintain a friendship with Steve. Regardless of what may have occurred between them, it was important to her to keep her daughter's father in the picture and to ensure that things remained positive and friendly. It wouldn't be long, though, before an old flame would return to Richmond and rekindle the fire that had once existed between them. 7 years after leaving, Bobby returned in 1998, and it was clear to everyone around that the former couple had continued to carry torches for one another. Essentially, when Bobby walked back into town, there was very little time which elapsed between his return and his reconnecting with Nikki. In an interview, Bobby himself described it as, quote, "I came back. We had got back together the minute I got back, it seemed, from California, and it went on from there." End quote. This time around, their relationship would be very different. The young couple had grown up, matured, and become more focused on what it was they truly wanted out of life. For Bobby, he'd appeared to have shed his old playboy behavior and was now looking to create something real. Nikki recognized the change, and while she'd always carried a place in her heart for Bobby, seeing him now as a more mature version of himself, she found it hard to resist his advances. Of course, for Nikki, her priorities had shifted since they'd last been together. She had a daughter now, and her entire world revolved around Peyton. Michelle later explained, quote, "She loved being a mother. Peyton is her world. She wanted Peyton to have the finer things in life, so she busted her butt." End quote. For Bobby, to be able to make things work, he'd have to step up his game and contribute just as much as the driven and passionate woman he loved. Nikki acquired a job at the Montgomery Education and Pre-Release Center, a prison located in Dayton, Ohio. Nikki's position at the correctional facility began entry-level as a guard, but over time she'd prove herself through hard work and dedication. Eventually, Nikki would move out of the guard position and would be working in the office, doing mostly accounting, though she was also a member of the prison's hostage negotiating team, showing that her employers and bosses recognized her skill and intelligence. While working there, Nikki was also attending classes at Sinclair Community College, where she maintained a high GPA and was a consistent fixture on the dean's list. For the next few years, Nikki will work and attend school while balancing being a mother and a relationship with Bobby. She continued to hang on to her dreams of joining the FBI or the US Marshals. As the 90s came to an end, Nikki entered the 2000s in a position of happiness and hopefulness. It was early on that Bobby would get down on one knee and propose marriage, which Nikki happily accepted. The 27-year-old was finally putting it all together. She was engaged to the man that she loved since she was a teenager. Her daughter was beautiful, bright, and the center of her universe, and her career was on track. There was little, if anything, that Nikki didn't feel she could accomplish at this point in time. Unfortunately, by the summer of 2001, just a year into the new millennium, everything would change, and Nikki would become a missing person at the center of a complicated and confusing set of circumstances, with suspicions being cast in all directions. Nikki and Bobby's wedding was scheduled to take place on Saturday, August 18, 2001. As the date drew closer, the couple found themselves overwhelmed with the sheer volume of tasks required to be completed prior to their nuptials. In July of 2001, just 1 month out from the wedding, there were still several details that had to be ironed out. On Sunday, July 22nd, Nikki and Bobby found themselves trying to balance out household chores and wedding prep. On this particular morning, Bobby had arranged to drive over and pick up his cousin, at which time they would go to a local shop to get a tuxedo sized. Since Bobby was going to be out, Nikki decided it would be a good day to take their laundry down to the local laundromat. To make it easier for Nikki to travel with the laundry, she borrowed Bobby's GMC Jimmy SUV while he would drive her car. The two said goodbye to one another and estimated that they'd reconnect in the early evening when they were both finished. Bobby later stated, quote, "Last thing I said to Nikki was, I'll be back by 4 or 5 to do the wedding invitations that evening." End quote. Nikki left the apartment at approximately 12 p.m. and drove over to her parents' home, asking if they could watch Peyton, while she went down to the 1100 block of Southeast Street to the Richmond Coin Laundry, which has since changed owners and names. Nikki stayed at the laundromat while her clothes were in the wash, but as she shifted them into the dryer, she made the choice to drive over to her parents' home and visit for a while. This wasn't all that uncommon, as Nikki's sister Tammy later explained. She often did laundry on Sundays and would drop by to visit while the clothes were in the dryer. However, according to her mother Barbara, there may have been another reason she chose to come by on this particular day. Barbara later explained that when Nikki arrived, quote, "Something was really bugging her, like she couldn't throw it off. I kept saying, 'Now calm down, Nikki.'" End quote. According to Barbara, Nikki explained that there were several men at the laundromat who were harassing her, and she just wanted to get away from them. At that point, Barbara offered for Nikki to bring her laundry over to the house and finish it there, but Nikki turned down the offer. She was a tough woman, she could take care of herself, and she wanted to handle it on her own. I should note that there are some conflicting accounts of this, with Nikki's mom saying that she turned down the offer, but Nikki's sister implying that she actually accepted it and left to go get her clothes and bring them back. Regardless of Nikki's reason for leaving at that time and going back to the laundromat, this is the last time any member of her family will ever see her again. There have also been reports that, while at the house, Nikki placed several phone calls, including to a coworker, to discuss some kind of an issue which may have contributed to her agitation at the time. At approximately 4:30 p.m., Bobby returned home from the tuxedo sizing to find that Nikki had yet to return. According to him, there was no indication that she'd been back at all that afternoon. His SUV was not in the parking lot, the laundry she had taken with her was not present, and Nikki had a habit of kicking off her sandals right at the door, and they were not in the home either. Initially, Bobby wasn't concerned, as he assumed the laundry was either taking longer than he'd assumed, or that Nikki was visiting family and would return soon enough. However, as the minutes began passing, Bobby found himself growing concerned. It was unlike Nikki to be gone for a prolonged period of time without so much as a phone call. Bobby later stated, quote, "The time I started thinking something might be wrong was between 6 and 7, with no phone call or anything. Then, from that point, it went to another hour, and there'd been no word." End quote. Around this time, Bobby placed a call over to Nikki's parents' home to ask if they'd seen her or not. He was told that she had stopped by earlier but hadn't returned from the laundromat, and Peyton was still with them. Bobby still wasn't overly concerned, explaining, quote, "I just assumed that she was over at a friend's house, just, chatting about the wedding and doing extra shopping, too." End quote. Shortly after this call, Michelle dropped by to visit and was asked if she'd seen Nikki. When she explained that she hadn't, her sister Tammy told her that no one had seen Nikki since she'd stopped by earlier, and Bobby was looking for her and getting worried. When Nikki failed to return to pick up Peyton, concern escalated, but didn't yet reach a point of panic. It wasn't uncommon for Nikki to get called into work, and so at this particular point in time, the assumption was that Nikki had gone into work and that she'd call when she got a chance. A visit to the laundromat showed that Nikki's vehicle was not there, nor was there any sign of her along the way between the laundromat and her mother's home or her own apartment. With each passing hour, the family grew more and more concerned, and finally, Barbara placed a call to Peyton's father, Steve, asking if he could pick her up so they could go out looking. After Peyton was picked up, several of Nikki's siblings and Bobby descended on Barbara's home to try and work out a plan as to how they were going to track down Nikki and find out what was going on. The first idea was to begin calling local hospitals, wondering if it was possible that Nikki may have gotten into an accident. These calls took place between 9 and 10 p.m. While this was happening, other family members decided to drive to Nikki's job in Dayton, wondering if she had broken down somewhere along the route, but after going there and back, they failed to see any signs of Nikki or Bobby's vehicle. It was during the meeting with the family that more details came to the surface which caused even greater worry. Bobby informed them at that time that Nikki had left her purse and ID in their apartment, and it seemed highly unlikely she'd have gone anywhere, even to work, without having stopped back in to pick those items up. It's around this time that Nikki's father finally suggested that this wasn't something they could figure out themselves, and he urged that they file a missing persons report. The decision to file the report takes place at approximately 11 p.m., though despite the family's urgency and insistence that something must be wrong, Richmond police suggested that they wait at least until the next day to file, as it's entirely possible that Nikki would show up. Begrudgingly, the family agreed to wait until the next day. They then placed a call to the Montgomery Pre-Education and Release Center, asking them to call if Nikki failed to arrive for her scheduled shift the next day. While they knew something was wrong, because Nikki would never fail to pick up her daughter, they also knew that if she didn't show up to work, then it was worse than they imagined. Nikki never missed a shift. On Monday, July 23rd, an official missing persons report was filed with the Richmond Police Department. Initially, though, the report was not taken very seriously. Investigators, when they became aware of the pending wedding, raised the possibility that Nikki may have gotten cold feet and was simply off somewhere taking some time to get her head together. The family, though, strongly contradicted that belief and was sure that something was wrong. Nikki wouldn't just leave, and if she did, she wouldn't have left Peyton, nor her ID and purse. For investigators, though, they had little to implicate that a crime had taken place. Detective Lieutenant Bradley Berner later stated, quote, "There were no phone calls indicating any trouble. There were no indicators that any harm had came to her." End quote. While looking for information about what may have happened to Nikki, several family members spoke to people at the laundromat and in the surrounding area, though none seemed to have remembered anything significant. Employees of the laundromat also explained that they had not seen anything the previous day, which suggested to them that any of the people using their laundromat were being harassed. A surveillance video was found, which shows Nikki purchasing a drink and/or making change for the laundromat at a deli located nearby. Initially, it was believed that this footage would provide clues as to what may have happened to Nikki, but upon examination, the footage is time-stamped prior to Nikki visiting her mother the day she disappeared. When investigators looked over the tape, it was in line with their beliefs that no crime had taken place. There was no evidence of anyone following Nikki, and when she walked out to the parking lot, entered her vehicle and left, no one appeared to have been driving behind her either. Investigators followed up at the laundromat, and Detective Berner later explained, quote, "They had no information that there was any altercations outside the laundromat. Nothing really raised red flags on it." End quote. For investigators, they believe the most likely scenario was either cold feet or that Nikki had gotten into an argument with Bobby and elected to leave for a period of time to cool down. With little assistance from police early on, the family took it upon themselves to try and find Nikki. They organized together and assigned different areas of town to look around, knocking on doors and showing pictures. They created flyers bearing Nikki's image and posted them everywhere. Michelle paid a visit to Nikki's job that day, stating later, quote, "I know she didn't miss work. Work was Nikki's life. They buzzed me in. I came in and asked, 'Has she shown up for work yet?' And they said, 'No, we haven't seen Nikki.' At that moment, I broke down. I started crying my eyes out. Oh my God, what has happened to Nikki?" End quote. When Nikki failed to show up for work, while this was a clear indicator that something bad had happened, it did result in one positive change. Law enforcement now agreed that this may be more than just a person running off. After they checked and noted that there was no activity on Nikki's bank account or cell phone, police started with something easy. The first task was to try and locate the SUV Nikki had been driving that day. A police helicopter was used to scour Richmond from the sky, but despite their efforts, they were unable to locate the vehicle at that time. It was around this time that both law enforcement and the family began to grow suspicious of the person who was closest to Nikki, her fiance Bobby Webster. Tammy later explained, quote, "When we were doing the searches, of course, you don't care about what you look like. You see people out there. We were a mess. I mean, if you see some of the photographs, you will see, but he was always the clean person. He was always dressed up. I guess ready for if he was on camera." End quote. While dressing nicely isn't exactly startlingly suspicious behavior, there were several things which took place in the days after Nikki's disappearance that investigators found particularly curious. According to investigators, Bobby had done 3 things rather quickly that they found bizarre. Firstly, he had called and canceled the hall in which they were going to have the wedding, getting a refund for their deposit. Next, he took the rings back to try and get the money back for them, but they were on layaway, so there really wasn't any money for him to get back. And he allegedly placed a call to Nikki's school, inquiring about her tuition and whether or not he could get that money back as well. Detective Berner later explained, quote, "Right off the bat he calls the college and is wanting all of her college money. He gets so irate with the person that he's talking to on the phone that the lady that's in charge of the financing talks to him and tells him that she has no money, that her tuition was being paid for by her employer." End quote. When confronted with these actions, Bobby believed he had solid explanations. In regard to canceling the hall, Bobby said, quote, "I never told anyone it was canceled, but at that time it's obvious the last thing on my mind is this wedding. I want Nikki, and then the wedding is second to that." End quote. In regard to returning the rings, Bobby claimed he only wanted to do so to get some money to purchase a cell phone. He didn't have one at the time, and he thought it would make communication easier when they were all out looking for Nikki. In regard to her tuition, Bobby claimed he did call about it, but was not trying to get his hands on the money. Ultimately, Bobby also claimed he was trying to gather funds to offer a reward as well. It's after these incidents that investigators requested that Bobby come down and submit to a polygraph test. Bobby agreed and took the test, though the results were not in his favor. According to investigators, Bobby showed deception when asked if he knew what happened to Nikki. Bobby, though, claims that the question was actually whether or not he felt responsible for her disappearance, to which he said that, as a man, it was his duty to protect Nikki, so of course he felt responsible. At this point, investigators had no solid proof that Bobby played a role in Nikki's disappearance, and so they could not label him as a suspect, but he was considered a person of interest. It was their belief at the time that Bobby possessed information about Nikki's disappearance that he wasn't being forthcoming about. Bobby, to this day, denies any knowledge of what may have happened to her. Nikki's family, though, faced with what they believed were suspicious behaviors, began to shut Bobby out. Around this same time, tensions between the Richmond police and Nikki's family began to boil over. Believing that investigators weren't doing enough to find her, several of Nikki's siblings began getting aggressive in their search, including threatening violence and forcing people to speak to them. Several of Nikki's brothers were arrested during this time, though Barbara later stated, quote, "We may have stepped on a few people's feet, but I'm not going to apologize for that because I'm trying to find my baby." End quote. Nearly 3 months will pass before the case gets a break. During the course of those 3 months, investigators continued to examine the case while family members kept searching on their own, but neither side was successful in discovering any true evidence. It wouldn't be until November 3rd, 2001, that investigators would receive a call from the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office in Ohio that Nikki's vehicle had finally been located. For police, it was great news, as they assumed they'd be able to uncover physical evidence and, just by examining the state of the vehicle, might have a good idea of what actually happened. The SUV had been found in the parking lot of the Meadows of Catalpa apartment complex in Dayton. Curiously enough, this was the same apartment complex that Steve Johnston lived in, Nikki's former boyfriend and Peyton's father. Initial inspection of the vehicle noted that the laundry Nikki had been doing the day she vanished was folded neatly in a basket in the back seat. The driver's seat was in the position Nikki would have used. Nikki stands only 5 feet 2 inches tall, and the proximity of the seat to the steering wheel would suggest that either Nikki was the last person to have driven the SUV, someone put it back into position after having moved it to accommodate themselves, or that whoever had been driving the vehicle couldn't have been much taller than Nikki. For investigators, the fact that the vehicle was found near Steve's apartment brought him into the realm of being considered a person of interest. While the vehicle was taken away back to Indiana for further processing, Johnston was questioned. He denied any knowledge or involvement in Nikki's disappearance. He was asked to take a polygraph, to which he agreed, and he did pass. He also offered up his fingerprints and DNA to investigators. When the vehicle was later inspected by forensic examinators, to their shock and surprise, nothing was found. No fingerprints, no traces of blood or any other sources of DNA, no strange fibers, nothing which would indicate that anyone else had been in the vehicle. There was, however, signs that maybe one of the door locks had been punched out and the radio may have been stolen, which would seem to suggest that someone else had to be in the vehicle, and yet that person failed to leave behind any evidence. Either way, for investigators, the discovery of the vehicle opened several doors. Firstly, they now had more than just Bobby as a person of interest. Beyond that, they had the belief that Nikki's disappearance may be tied to someone in Dayton, and after further investigating, they would find that Steve Johnston was not the only person who lived quite close to where Nikki's SUV had been found. Tommy Swint worked with Nikki at the correctional facility, and according to many who knew Nikki, their relationship was a complicated one. According to Michelle, Nikki looked at Tommy like an older brother, but it was apparent that Tommy had a sexual interest in Nikki. All of this boiled over on one particular occasion where Michelle explained she'd been going to visit her sister. When she arrived, she heard Nikki shouting, and when she entered the apartment, she found Tommy leaning over her. Nikki had her foot pressed against Tommy's chest as though she was trying to keep him away from her. According to Michelle, Nikki called out for help, explaining that she believed Tommy was trying to rape her. To this day, Michelle believes that had she not shown up at that time, Nikki may have been raped. In a twist, Tommy Swint just happened to live a quarter of a mile from where the SUV was found. In addition to this, several of Nikki's sisters pointed out that at her bridal shower some weeks before, Tommy Swint had gifted her lingerie. He was not there in person, but instead sent the lingerie through the mail. At the time, they found it odd. In hindsight, they found it disturbing. Faced with this new person of interest but no evidence, investigators decided to try and speak with Swint to get some answers as to what he may or may not have known. Unfortunately, Swint refused to cooperate, and when investigators tried to talk to him, he didn't want to participate in any conversations. Without any physical evidence, or really any evidence at all, to tie Swint to Nikki's disappearance, there was nothing authorities could do to force Swint to talk to them. Now, the case was at an impasse. They had 3 men, all of who were connected to Nikki in some way, one of which was not cooperating, and for none of whom did they have any actual evidence. It's at this time that the case begins to grow cold. Several years will pass before there's any movement on Nikki's disappearance. Over the course of those years, Nikki's family is devastated by the loss. While some maintain hope that she's alive and will be found, others must confront the possibility that someone has taken her life. Nikki's daughter continues to grow up, being raised in combination by her aunts, uncles, and grandparents. She's frequently told about her mother, but over time, it becomes a point of pain and frustration for the young woman. She watches as friends spend time with their mothers, and she can't help but feel overwhelmed knowing that she may never see her mother again, though she does maintain the hope that she will. In 2004, the family worked with a missing persons organization, and together they were able to offer a $100,000 reward for information leading to Nikki. It's believed at the time that if anyone knows what happened, they won't be able to resist that reward. They even held a press conference to announce it and to remind people about the details of the case. The agreement allowed the reward to be available for 20 days. No one came forward during that time, and no new information was obtained. On the 5-year anniversary of Nikki's disappearance, July 22, 2006, the family held a candlelight vigil at the laundromat. It was their hope to drum up attention and to rekindle the involvement of the media in Nikki's case. Peyton, 14 at the time, was present at the vigil and spoke publicly about her mother and asked for the public's assistance in locating her. When Michelle was asked about the case, about Nikki, and about the years that had passed, she responded, quote, "It's like you're living a nightmare and you just wish that you could wake up. Your life was fine. Now you have a missing sister." End quote. Unfortunately, no new information was discovered, and no one came forward at that time. 1 year later, in August of 2007, investigators will make a discovery which not only surprises them, but disturbs them greatly. Richmond police were shocked to discover that Tommy Swint, one of their people of interest, was no longer employed at the correctional facility and was, instead, working as a police officer in the town of Trotwood, Ohio. Upon realizing this, several investigators from Richmond traveled to Trotwood, at which time they had a meeting with the police chief. They asked him if Swint had revealed that he was a person of interest in a missing persons case when he'd applied for the job. He had not, and when the chief learned of his possible involvement in Nikki's disappearance, Swint was given two options. He could resign or be fired. Ultimately, Swint resigned, but he was not going to take it quietly. It was at this time that Swint filed a lawsuit against the Richmond Police Department, alleging that he had never been told that he was a person of interest. During the back and forth which took place in the media, including the Richmond police publicly stating that they had in fact told Swint he was a person of interest, Tommy claimed that he had fully cooperated. Authorities responded by asking him to submit a DNA sample, which he then did through his lawyer. Ultimately, Swint was no longer a member of the Trotwood Police Department, and his lawsuit against the city of Richmond was dismissed. The lawsuit, though, had turned a lot of cameras towards Swint and gained national coverage. His face was on newspapers and in headlines, and in a way, this would be the first incident in what would become a chain reaction of new information. In November of 2007, Detective Patty Tackett of the Dayton Police Department received an anonymous tip. This caller suggested the possibility that Tommy Swint should be investigated for his connection to a homicide. Shockingly, the name of the victim was not Niqui McCown, but instead 33-year-old Tina Marie Ivory, who had been discovered murdered in Dayton 16 years previously. Ivory had been operating as a sex worker at the time and had disappeared. Forest workers had uncovered her body shortly thereafter. Ivory had died as the result of strangulation and blunt force trauma. Her body had been wrapped in a blanket, which was then circled multiple times with tape to secure it, and then dumped off a side road where locals frequently discarded trash. At the time, DNA had been recovered from the blanket and from the victim's jacket, and investigators had developed a profile based on that DNA, but they never had gotten a match before. The Dayton Police Department was not in possession of Swint's DNA in order to make a comparison, but thanks to his lawsuit, the Richmond Police Department was, and so Detective Tackett reached out to the Richmond police, who were more than happy to provide her with his DNA. When processed, Swint's DNA matched blood that had been found on the blanket, as well as 2 of the 4 spots of semen which had been discovered on Ivory's jacket. At the time, Swint was completely unaware that he was being looked at for his role in the murder of Tina Marie Ivory, but he would soon find out. Swint had left town. He'd left the state, in fact. He was now living in Alabama, where he was working as a security guard. While they had the DNA to tie him to the crime, they'd also recovered fingerprints on the tape that had been used to wrap up Ivory. Wanting to ensure that they crossed every T and dotted every I, investigators wanted to obtain Swint's fingerprints for comparison. While driving home from work, Swint was stopped by a police officer, brought down to the station, and at this time was informed that they wanted his fingerprints and were investigating him as a possible suspect in the murder of Tina Marie Ivory. At the time, Swint, still dressed in his security guard uniform on the interrogation video, agreed to give his fingerprints. They were a match to those found on the tape. The Richmond Police Department were excited by the prospect. Were Swint indicted for the murder, he'd be in jail, and they'd have the ability to speak with him about Nikki while he awaited trial. They thought, at the time, they might be able to convince him to admit to his involvement in Nikki's disappearance by offering some kind of a plea deal. Everything seemed to finally be falling into place, and Nikki's family, while heartbroken at what the possibility meant about her likelihood of being deceased, they wanted answers, and they wanted justice. The indictment came through on February 3rd, 2010 at 12 p.m. Dayton officials contacted police officers in Russell County, Alabama, and it was their job to arrest Tommy Swint and send him to Ohio to face trial for the murder of Tina Marie Ivory. Unfortunately, things did not go according to plan. Alabama law enforcement officers made the drive towards Swint's home. At the time, they were being safe, but they had no indication that Swint might respond violently. He had been cooperative about the fingerprints after all. However, upon arriving at Swint's residence at approximately 1 p.m., just 1 hour after the indictment had been issued, authorities approached his front door and announced their presence and were immediately met with the sound of a gunshot. After taking proper precautions and breaking down the door, authorities discovered Tommy Swint's body, a gun in his hand. He had died as the result of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. For everyone involved, all law enforcement, the Ivory family, and Nikki's family, it was absolutely heartbreaking. Swint had taken the easy way out and never had to answer for what he'd done. While for investigators, this wrapped up their investigation into the murder of Tina Marie Ivory, there simply wasn't enough evidence or information to close the case of Niqui McCown. When asked about Swint, Michelle later responded, quote, "I was really upset that he took himself out. I wanted him to face the music. I want to be able to look at that person in the face and tell them how they destroyed my family, ask them why they took my sister. I feel my family deserves at least that opportunity." End quote. For investigators, they didn't have the evidence they needed to close the case. They didn't have the information they would like to have obtained to locate Nikki, but they also believed that Tommy Swint was likely the man responsible for her disappearance on that Sunday afternoon in July. In the aftermath, Swint's DNA has been compared to that recovered from the sites of several unsolved homicides connected predominantly to sex workers, though there has not been another match yet. Still, officials consider the possibility that Swint may have committed other murders which they have yet to discover. In regard to what he knew and whether or not he was involved in Nikki's disappearance, there is one lingering belief that at least one other person may have information. Detective Michelle Miller, when asked about the possibility of being able to solve Nikki's disappearance with Swift gone, responded, quote, "I believe there's another person of interest that Tommy was close to that has some of the answers, if not all of them. There's another person. It was a coworker of his that he had a relationship with, and I believe that person probably does know more." End quote. To date, this woman who is believed to possess information has never come forward nor spoken publicly about Tommy Swint, Tina Marie Ivory, or Niqui McCown. In every case, there is someone who has information that could bring salvation, peace, and acceptance to a family racked with pain and hurt. In this particular case, investigators know who that person is, but she isn't talking. After all was said and done, Bobby and Steve were officially declared as no longer being persons of interest. Law enforcement firmly believes that Tommy Swint was the man who possessed the answers as to Nikki's location, and now they can only hope that the woman who they believe has the answers comes forward, or that by some other method they're able to discover Nikki's location, to give her family closure, to give them answers, to give them the ability to have a place to mourn their daughter, their sister, and their mother. In a case that spans 18 years, there's a great debate about what may have occurred. While the majority of individuals who examine this case all believe one particular theory, there is another which has been put forth, though to a much lesser degree. The first theory is that Niqui McCown became the victim of a random act of violence, that her disappearance is in no way tied to anyone she actually knew, and despite the fact that she was sexually assaulted by a man who was later shown to be a murderer, some do not believe Swint was the man responsible for her disappearance. The second theory, and by far the most popular theory, is that Tommy Swint was a violent misogynist who had killed at least one woman before, and having been spurned by Nikki, who was not only not interested in him intimately, but was also marrying another man, Swint may have struck out violently, murdering Nikki stashing her vehicle at her ex's apartment complex, knowing that eventually it would be found, and if possible tied to her ex and not himself. When last seen, Niqui McCown was described as being an African-American female with light brown hair and brown eyes. Nikki stands 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighs approximately 115 pounds. Nikki has a small scar above her left eye, a small scar on the right side of her face, a scar on the top of her head, and a large scar on her left lower leg. When last seen, Nikki was wearing a bright pink and purple floral swimsuit top, dark-colored shorts, diamond earrings, and a white gold bracelet. She was last seen in the vicinity of the Richmond Coin Laundry laundromat near the 1100 block of South E Street in Richmond, Indiana. Niqui McCown is a bright and beautiful light in the world. She has a family who loves her deeply and a daughter who she never got to witness growing up into the wonderful young woman that she has become. 17 long years have passed, and 18 will be this July. It's believed that someone knows exactly what happened here, and I can only implore that that individual do what is right to assuage the grief of a family. An anonymous call, an email, anything. Just tell them what you know. Unfortunately, unless someone comes forward with their knowledge of this case, of Tommy Swint's actions, or of Niqui McCown's location, this case tragically remains open and unsolved. The case of Niqui McCown is one of the most requested cases I've received over the past several months. I've been aware of Nikki's case for several years and have read up on it in the past. I thought I had a rather firm grip on the state of the case, but it wasn't until I started digging for the research for this episode that I discovered so much information that I'd never heard before. This is a terribly tragic and heartbreaking story, but also possibly one of the most solvable cases I've ever covered. There's no word to express the utter frustration of how close investigators came to unearthing all the truth, let alone the knowledge that there may be a woman out there who knows all of the answers and could so easily give closure to not only a family, but a city. It's been nearly 18 years since any of Nikki's loved ones last saw her. Nikki's daughter, Peyton, who was 6 years old when Nikki vanished, is now approaching 24 years old. She's now only 4 years younger than her mother was the day she vanished, and that's far too long for a child to go without knowing what happened to her mother, who she loved so desperately. Unlike many of the cases covered here, there's very little in terms of theories about this case. In fact, it was hard to find a theory that even discussed a possibility outside of Tommy Swint. I suppose I could have presented this case with only a single theory, but I thought it made more sense to address the much lesser discussed unknown individual theory first, before approaching the widely believed theory. I should note, I don't look into Bobby or Steve in this episode, as they have long since been removed from investigators' persons of interest list. This is where we will begin, with those who still argue the possibility that Niqui McCown's disappearance could be the result of one or more yet unidentified individuals. The speculation that Nikki's disappearance might be tied to yet unnamed individuals spins out of the statements Nikki is supposed to have said the day she disappeared. According to interviews with several members of Nikki's family, she claimed to have been being harassed by several men down at the laundromat. The exact details of the harassment are unknown, with some speculating that the men were being sexually aggressive and flirtatious and making Nikki uncomfortable, while others have considered the possibility that the men may have been making violent threats against Nikki or some other measure of harassment for which we simply don't have enough information to describe. In multiple articles, interviews, and crime discussion forums, I've seen the people who had been harassing Nikki that day described as being 3 Hispanic males. It seems that this was a detail that Nikki may have delivered to her family that day, though I haven't found anything which verifies there were even Hispanic males present in a laundromat that day. Remember, Nikki's family as well as members of law enforcement questioned the employees. They didn't recall any altercations taking place. They didn't witness any harassment. Now, we can't know if that's 100% true, as they may not have wanted to have admitted that they knew something untoward was happening and didn't go into action, or perhaps they could have known the individuals present and are covering for them. Unfortunately, we can't know that, though no evidence has ever been found to suggest that any men were present and committing harassment that day. At the same time, when you examine it, why would Nikki say that was happening if it wasn't? She wasn't the type to ask for help or to want others to worry about her, so it doesn't make sense that she'd make it up if it wasn't true. Unfortunately, we just don't have enough information about that day. Sure, there's surveillance footage from a nearby deli, and in it, Nikki seems fine. But we also know this occurred before she visited her mother, before she reported the harassment. So it's entirely possible that the harassment took place after she left the deli. Assuming that something did happen, it's entirely possible that Nikki could have gathered her clothing to leave the laundromat, found herself in her vehicle when any of these individuals could have approached, brandished a weapon, and made her drive somewhere. That's a possibility which can't be dismissed so easily. Of course, there are too many details which would then be really coincidental if this happened. The fact that the SUV was found in Dayton, in her ex's apartment complex, a quarter of a mile from Swint's house. The idea that no DNA, fingerprints, fiber, or blood was found in her vehicle. The idea that Nikki would be carjacked, for lack of a better term, in Richmond, but her vehicle would be abandoned in Dayton and not driven to some chop shop somewhere to part it out. None of it really makes any sense. So, is it possible that Nikki met with foul play as the result of a completely random encounter, or due to some men harassing her at a laundromat, or some other situation for which we have no information or evidence? Sure, it seems highly unlikely, especially when you weigh information that will be provided in the second theory discussion, but it's not 100% impossible. It just seems like, out of all the possibilities we're faced with in this case, this one is hardly there. Some people still believe it. Some people argue that this is why they couldn't find any evidence to link Nikki's disappearance to Swint that day. But overall, this is considered a secondary theory, and it is a very, very distant second. But in the interest of being thorough, I did want to address it. So that brings us to the second theory, and the one which most people believe, that Tommy Swint, former co-worker of Nikki's and murderer of Tina Marie Ivory, is likely responsible for Nikki's disappearance. The deeper you dig into Swint, the more disturbing information you uncover. This was clearly not a man who had his head on straight. So let's examine Swint a little more thoroughly. Swint was born in Alabama in 1966. He enlisted in the Marines in 1986 at 19 and ended up serving much of his time overseas in both Panama and Japan. In later discussions, Swint admitted to having utilized sex workers in both foreign countries, though honestly the idea of a soldier visiting a sex worker in another country isn't exactly a shocking turn of events. However, when you think about the fact that Ivory was a sex worker, it's certainly in line with Swint's behaviors to have visited her. While serving in the Marines, Swint went AWOL and fled to Dayton, Ohio. He was allowed to live with some relatives and eventually was caught and sent back to Camp Lejeune. Swint, later requesting a discharge, stated weird facts such as his father didn't love him and he wanted to be in the military police and not just a soldier. Ultimately, he was discharged under other than honorable conditions. Swint then kept pursuing careers in law enforcement. He tried to join the Ohio Highway Patrol at one point, but was denied. He also tried to become a law enforcement officer with Sinclair Community College, the town of Butler, and Wright State University. All of them denied him. In 1992, he was arrested for passing bad checks. Swint ultimately found himself working at the Montgomery Education and Pre-Release Center, where he acted as a prison guard. During his time here, there are multiple reports of Swint behaving inappropriately and displaying aggression towards female coworkers. In fact, one incident on his record showed that he had threatened a female captain, stating, quote, "If I have anything to say to you, I will say it in the parking lot. You don't know who you're messing with. I'm Officer Swint." End quote. When you factor that in with Michelle's story of the attempted rape, it doesn't take a lot to see that Swint obviously had both violence issues and anger with women issues. During several interviews over the years with Swint, as well as those who knew him, he swore he hated sex workers, despite the fact that we now know he was a client of several. He also swore up and down that he was heterosexual, though several acquaintances have said that Swift frequented gay nightclubs. It should be noted, he also claimed to have hated homosexuals. A former girlfriend of Swint's told authorities that she believed that he hadn't actually been visiting Ivory as a client of her sex work, but was instead dating her. This same woman's nephew later reported to authorities that he recalled seeing blood leading from a window through the grass to Swint's vehicle around the time Ivory disappeared. Swint was first visited in relation to the murder of Tina Marie Ivory in 2008 when he was shown photos of the decedent as well as the blanket in which she was wrapped. Swint at the time denied any knowledge. When he was later asked for his fingerprints, he was again showed photos of Ivory and again denied any knowledge of even who she was. He was then directly asked if he had killed her, and he said no. When he was told that they'd matched his DNA, Swint immediately ended the interview and said he would need to speak with his lawyer. After his death, several different processes were used to try and tie Swint to other victims, including using his DNA as well as geographical profiling. Most experts who have looked at the case agree that Swint fits the profile of a serial killer, but they have yet to connect him directly to any other crime other than the murder of Ivory. So where does that leave Swint with Nikki? Well, reportedly he had a sexual interest in her, may have attempted to have raped her in the past, sent lingerie to her for her bridal shower, and, as we have since discovered, was a violent and brutal killer when he wanted to be. The one question many people have is, how did Swint get to Nikki on this particular Sunday? That's a question for which we simply don't have an answer, though the fact that it's been said that Nikki called a coworker has always made me wonder if she spoke to either Swint or perhaps the woman authorities allege knows more about this case. Perhaps, indeed, if this woman played a role in setting Nikki up to be cornered by Swint, that might explain why she's been so resistant to speak out about what she knows. Either way, somehow, someway, Nikki encountered Swint that day. The most likely scenario seems to be that she was lured out to Dayton, whether this was by some connection to her job or through some other means of deception. Authorities do believe there's a good chance that Nikki is the one who parked the SUV in the apartment complex the day she disappeared, but they can't know for sure. It may not have been something she suspected. As we've heard from family, it was not uncommon for Nikki to get called and to head into work at the drop of a hat. She loved her job and she worked hard. However, she didn't call and tell her parents that she wouldn't be picking up her daughter, which seems to suggest that she didn't think she'd be gone too long. Her laundry was done. She took the time to finish it. Is it possible she then drove out to work or to meet someone, assuming she'd be back quickly, and that's when it all went bad? Swint knew Nikki. For a period of time, she looked at him like an older brother, so it's not outside of the realm of possibility that he knew about her life. He'd have known that her ex and the father of her daughter lived in Dayton, not too far from where he lived. It's entirely possible that he could have placed the SUV in that parking lot to try and throw suspicion onto Steve Johnston. Beyond that, he had been obsessed with law enforcement his entire life, so it isn't out of the realm of possibility to assume he could have wiped down and thoroughly cleaned the SUV so as to not leave any evidence behind which may have linked him to Nikki. No matter what way you slice it, the situation is extremely suspicious. Remember, if this is in fact the man who attempted to rape Nikki, it seems highly unlikely she'd have been willing to have gone anywhere alone with him. If she'd seen him in Richmond, the town 40 miles from where he lived, while out doing laundry, it doesn't make a lot of sense that she'd have talked to him, let alone gone anywhere with him. It really only seems to leave the possibility that she was tricked into going to him. We know Nikki was upset that day. It's been reported that she was harassed at the laundromat, but what if she was really more upset about something else? What if Swint had threatened her, or found some way to push her buttons or twist her arm into seeing him? We may never know, but it seems more than probable that if there was a meeting between Swint and Nikki the day she vanished, it was not one she wanted to be a part of. With Swint having committed suicide, most people view this as essentially a confession, and while I don't disagree, there are certain details that make me question that. Swint knew from investigators when they asked for his fingerprints that they were looking at him for the murder of Tina Marie Ivory. He obviously knew he'd committed that murder. I'm sure at this point he knew his time was running out, and probably the decision to take his own life rather than serve time was made pretty quickly. When he was told that his DNA matched, that his fingerprints matched, that he was the prime suspect, he had to have known the end was coming. When he saw police show up at his house, he knew he was going to be arrested and took the cowardly way out. However, there is nothing which suggests that, at this time, he believed there was any connection between this investigation and the disappearance of Niqui McCown. So yes, I 100% believe Swint took his life because he knew he'd murdered Ivory and he didn't want to go to jail for it. He knew they had him. When it comes to Nikki, though, he had to have known they had nothing on him. Perhaps he'd learned from Ivory's case to better conceal a body so as for it to not come back to haunt him. Again, we may never know, but it appears quite clear in the nearly 20 years since, wherever Niqui McCown is, she's yet to be recovered. So it's entirely possible Swint didn't think about Nikki's case as a reason for his suicide. Taking what information we have, what evidence exists, and what facts are known, the most likely scenario related to the disappearance of Niqui McCown is that Tommy Swint played a role. Tommy Swint likely knows exactly what happened, but he can't talk anymore. What it is that led authorities to believe that a female coworker of Swint's has information, I can't say for certain, but if indeed Nikki was lured out, it's highly likely someone else played a role in that, as it doesn't seem like Nikki would have been willing to drive out to Dayton just for Swint. So is it possible that Swint had an accomplice? Absolutely. The fact of the matter is, there's hardly anyone who doesn't believe that Tommy Swint is responsible for this crime. They simply can't fully pin it on him yet, but it does seem like this is by far the most likely scenario. So in a case with so much information pointing towards one individual, how has it not yet been solved? Well, because there are still people hiding things. There's still a good chance that at least one person out there knows the truth and is either concealing it out of some misguided loyalty to Swint or to protect herself from possible legal repercussions. We can only hope that this changes, that something is found, that someone talks, that the truth breaks through and the answers can finally be known for certain. Sure, there's a certain comfort in it for Nikki's loved ones to believe that the man responsible is dead, but at the same time, they desperately would like to bring Nikki home. Niqui McCown vanished on July 22, 2001. Tommy Swint committed suicide nearly 9 years later. 9 years after that, and the answers still remain evasive. Swint has been gone now for nearly half as long as Nikki has been missing, and still we're left to wonder what the truth may be. This beautiful, brilliant, caring, and devoted mother and daughter is gone. Nikki dreamed of helping those who could not help themselves, who made mistakes and wanted to correct those mistakes and live a good life. We can only hope now that someone will come forward and provide the help and guidance that Nikki and her family so desperately require now. If you're looking for more information about the disappearance of Niqui McCown, there are many forums and news articles available. Disappeared covered her case, and there is a Facebook page dedicated to providing information about her and her disappearance. If you have any information about the vanishing of Niqui McCown, please contact the Richmond Police Department at 765-983-7247 or Crime Stoppers Indiana at 317-262-8477. What do you believe happened? Tweet me at TraceEvPod, message me on Instagram at TraceEvidencePod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, or comment in the Facebook group. I wanted to take a moment to thank all of you for your support while I've been struggling with my back issue. It's not fully healed at the moment, but I'm super glad I was able to get this episode out to you. Beyond that, I wanted to invite you to visit the newly revamped trace-evidence.com, where I've brought a lot of new material out, including full transcripts and a monthly drawing to win some Trace Evidence stickers, so make sure you check it out. This year, CrimeCon will be held in New Orleans from June 7th through the 9th. Amidst exciting presentations and inspiring discussions, I'm really looking forward to attending and representing Trace Evidence on Podcast Row. If you're planning to attend but haven't yet purchased your pass, you can save 10% by using the promo code TRACE19. Simply visit crimecon.com, select a standard pass, and use the code TRACE19. That's TRACE19 to save 10% today. I look forward to seeing you there. A special thank you goes out to Patreon producers Amanda Lee Ruth Smith, Krista Colvin, D'Earthy, Diane Dyson, Eamon Brady, Kate Alexander, Megan Cotter, Tara Doble, and the Reigns of Yesteryear. If you're interested in supporting Trace Evidence, please visit patreon.com/traceevidence. Visit trace-evidence.com for all episodes, social media links, merchandise, and more. I want to thank you all for listening to this episode, and remind you that if you're planning to attend CrimeCon in New Orleans, to use the promo code TRACE19 for 10% off a standard badge. I'll be on Podcast Row and can't wait to meet all of you. I hope you'll join me next week for another unsolved case, and this week I'm going to leave you with a promo for a new podcast featuring the amazing Mike Morford of Criminology.